Ash falls like snow over the burning remains of Priam's legacy. Screams pierce the orange smoke as Troy's impenetrable walls crumble from within. How did the most formidable fortress of the Bronze Age fall to a hollow wooden gift? Welcome to Somnolent. We are peeling back the layers of the most famous deception in warfare, separating the poet's lyrical myth from the brutal, buried reality discovered by the archaeologist's spade. To understand the wooden horse, we must first understand the stone that defied it. The world of the late 13th century before the Common Era was not a collection of isolated villages, but a sophisticated, interconnected network of empires. This was the age of bronze, an era where power was measured in tin and copper, and the trade routes of the Aegean were the veins of the known world. At the center of this web sat Troy, or Ilion, a citadel of staggering strategic importance. Situated on a hill now known as Hisarlik, it overlooked the Dardanelles, the narrow strait linking the Mediterranean to the Black Sea. Troy was more than a city. It was a maritime toll booth, a guardian of the grain and gold moving between east and west. Its wealth was legendary, and its walls were considered a miracle of engineering. The catalyst for the conflict is often painted in the soft hues of romance, the flight of Helen, the Queen of Sparta, with the Trojan prince Paris. But beneath the poetic drama of a stolen wife lay a far more pragmatic reality. The Mycenaean kings of mainland Greece, led by the ambitious Agamemnon, were looking for a reason to consolidate their power and seize the riches of the Anatolian coast. Helen may have been the face that launched 1,000 ships, but it was the promise of Trojan plunder and the control of the Hellespont that kept those ships at sea. When the Greek fleet finally pulled their black-holed vessels onto the sands of the Troad, they expected a short, glorious campaign. They expected the walls to crumble under the weight of their numbers. They were wrong. For 10 years, the war did not take place in the city, but on the dusty plain between the walls and the waves. The conflict became a grinding, agonizing stalemate. Year after year, the sun rose over the Ida Mountains to illuminate the same site, the formidable limestone ramparts of Troy, rising steep and angled to deflect any attempt at scaling. These were not the flimsy palisades of a minor chieftain. They were massive, battered walls built to withstand earthquakes and battering rams alike. The Greeks found themselves caught in a logistical nightmare. They could not completely surround the city, as the Trojans maintained access to the interior of the country, allowing supplies and reinforcements from allies like the Lycians and the Thracians to trickle in. Life for the Greek soldiers became a cycle of boredom punctuated by moments of extreme violence. They lived in a makeshift city of huts and tents along the shore, their ships rotting in the salt air and their spirits eroding with every passing season. The legendary heroes, Achilles, Ajax, Diomedes, performed great feats of strength in the space between the armies, but these individual duels achieved nothing of strategic value. The war had become a slow rot. The Greek camps were plagued by disease, internal squabbles over the spoils of nearby raids, and a growing sense of futility. They were 1,000 miles from home, fighting for a cause that felt increasingly distant. Inside the city, the pressure was equally suffocating. The Trojans were prisoners behind their own magnificent defenses. They watched from the heights of the Scaean gates as their fields were burned and their livestock driven away. The city was crowded with refugees and the families of fallen soldiers. The pride of King Priam was being tested by the slow starvation of his people and the constant sight of the Greek fires burning on the beach every night, a reminder that the enemy was not going away. Brute force had failed both sides. The Greeks could not break in, and the Trojans could not push them back into the sea. The 10th year brought the breaking point. The traditional methods of Bronze Age warfare, chariot charges, phalanx formations, and direct assaults had been exhausted. The greatest warriors on both sides were dead. their bodies burned on massive pyres that lit the night sky. The sheer exhaustion of a decade of death had stripped away the initial thirst for glory. It was no longer a matter of who was braver or who had the stronger gods. It was a matter of who would survive the winter. The stalemate had created a vacuum that could not be filled by a sword or a spear. It required a different kind of weapon. It required a shift from the physical to the psychological. It was in this atmosphere of desperation and war-weariness that the idea of the horse began to take shape, not as a symbol of worship, but as a calculated gamble born from the realization that if the gates would not open for an army, they might be opened by a lie. The age of heroes was ending, and the age of the strategist was about to begin. With the giants fallen, a chilling silence descended over the plains of the Troad. The screams of Achilles and the steadfast defiance of Hector had been the heartbeat of this conflict for a decade. But now, that pulse was fading. The Greeks were weary, their ships rotting, and their spirits fractured by a siege that refused to break. They had tried the way of the warrior. They had hurled their best men against those limestone walls until the ground was soaked with the blood of an entire generation, and yet the gates of Troy remained locked. It became clear that the currency of the old world, sheer, unadulterated strength, was no longer enough to buy victory. This was the moment where the blade had to yield to the brain. Standing among the restless kings was Odysseus, the ruler of Ithaca. He was a man who moved through the world with a different kind of gravity. While others measured their worth by the weight of their shields, Odysseus measured his by the depth of his secrets. He was the embodiment of metis, a Greek concept of cunning, craftiness, and wisdom. If Achilles was a storm that tried to blow the walls down, Odysseus was the water that found the smallest crack in the foundation to freeze and shatter the stone from within. He understood a truth his predecessors had ignored. A city that cannot be broken can still be tricked into breaking itself. The Greek camp had become a graveyard of ambition. Where there once was the sound of whetstones on blades, there was now only the low murmur of men wondering if they would ever see their homes again. The leadership was fractured. Agamemnon's authority had been bruised by years of failure, and the loss of Achilles had stripped away the army's sense of destiny. In this vacuum of power, Odysseus didn't command through fear or birthright. He commanded through the sheer inevitability of his logic. He began to weave the narrative of the retreat, meticulously planning every detail of the Greek departure. He knew that the lie had to be absolute. It had to be a total performance. He wasn't just building a wooden structure. He was building a fiction that would lure the Trojans to their own funeral. The priests and the seers had long whispered of a divine stalemate. The prophecies were clear. Troy would not fall to the sword alone. There were conditions to be met, strange requirements involving the bones of heroes and the theft of sacred statues. Odysseus knew that as long as the Trojans felt they had the favor of the gods, they would never falter. To win, he had to steal their luck before he could steal their lives. This required a level of stealth and deception that horrified the old guard, who viewed such tactics as beneath the dignity of a true king. But the time for dignity had passed with Hector's funeral rites. The war had become a grindstone, wearing down the nobility of both sides until only the sharpest, most pragmatic edges remained. This was the birth of psychological warfare, the realization that the mind is a far more fragile target than the body. Think of the men who came before him. Ajax, a wall of a man who fought with a massive tower shield, was a creature of pure endurance. Diomedes was a whirlwind of fury. These men were the peak of human capability in a straight line. But a straight line is predictable. Odysseus operated in shadows and curves. He was the man who could infiltrate the city in rags, endure the lashes of a whip to sell his disguise, and sit in the very heart of the enemy's council without blinking. This shift in leadership marked a fundamental change in the Hellenic identity. The greats were dead because they were rigid. They were bronze pillars that could be snapped by the weight of time. Odysseus was like the willow. He bent, he shifted, and because of that, he was the only one left with the capacity to finish what the warriors had started. He recognized that the Trojans were weary of the same war he was. For 10 years they had looked out from their battlements and seen the same Greek fires burning on the beach. They were a city under pressure, and pressure makes people vulnerable to hope. Odysseus decided to give them that hope. He understood that the greatest weapon in his arsenal wasn't the spear, but the human inclination to want the nightmare to be over. If he could convince the Trojans that the Greeks had finally given up, that they had sailed away in shame, the relief would be so overwhelming that their judgment would vanish. He was crafting a masterpiece of theater, where the city of Troy was the audience and the wooden horse would be the final tragic act. The age of heroes had been defined by the light of the sun on polished armor. The age of the strategist would be defined by the darkness inside a hollow gift, where the only thing sharper than the swords of the hidden men was the mind that put them there. Under the guidance of Odysseus, the Greeks stopped trying to break the wall and started trying to break the Trojan spirit. The stage was now set for the most famous deception in history, not born of strength, but of a cold, calculated understanding of the human heart. That understanding of the heart began with fire. As the sun dipped below the Aegean horizon, the Trojan sentries watched from the heights of the Scaean Gate, expecting the usual sounds of the Greek camp, the rhythmic sharpening of swords, the shouting of commands, the smell of roasting meat. But that evening, the air carried something different. It carried the acrid, heavy scent of total destruction. The Greeks were burning their own shelters. Row after row of leather tents and wooden barracks, the homes of an invading army for a decade, were being surrendered to the flames. To those watching from the walls of Troy, it looked like the ultimate admission of defeat. It looked like a broken enemy finally turning its back on an impossible goal and choosing to leave nothing behind for their victors. Under the cover of that rising smoke, the Greek fleet began to move. This wasn't the organized, intimidating formation of a conquering force, but a hurried, seemingly desperate exit. Thousands of men boarded the black-hulled ships, their oars hitting the water in a frantic rhythm that echoed across the bay. They pushed off from the sand, their sails catching the evening wind until the hundreds of vessels became mere specks on the gray water, and then, eventually, nothing at all. They didn't go far, of course. Just behind the jagged cliffs and sandy dunes of the nearby island of Tenedos, the entire armada dropped anchor. They sat in a suffocating, disciplined silence, hidden by the geography of the coast, waiting for the trap to take hold. They were close enough to return in a single night's sail, but far enough to vanish from the Trojan sightline. Back on the shores of Troy, a terrifying silence took root. For 10 years, the beach had been a city of its own, a teeming hive of bronze, wood, and blood. Now, it was a graveyard of ash. The wind whipped through the charred remains of the camp, kicking up gray dust where heroes once stood. But in the center of that desolation, something impossible remained. A structure so vast it seemed to distort the horizon. The great wooden horse stood alone on the sand, its shadow stretching toward the city walls like a long, dark finger. It was a monolith of fir and oak, silent and motionless, a sudden monument in a landscape defined for a generation by motion and violence. Its eyes, carved from cold wood, seemed to stare blankly at the gates they had never been able to breach. Inside the city, the atmosphere was thick with a dangerous kind of hope. After 3,600 days of siege, the human mind loses its ability to process normalcy. The Trojans weren't just looking at an empty beach, they were looking for a reason to breathe again. Every mother who had lost a son, every soldier who had forgotten the face of his wife felt the pull of that emptiness. They wanted to believe the nightmare had simply evaporated. This was the psychological leverage Odysseus had counted on. He knew that exhaustion is a more powerful intoxicant than wine. He knew that if you give a drowning man a piece of wood, he won't ask if it's a life raft or a coffin, he will simply grab it. The desire for the war to be over was more powerful than any military intelligence or common sense. The debate on the walls must have been a frantic whisper. Is it a gift to the gods? Is it a peace offering left to ensure a safe voyage home? The Trojan leaders looked out at the horizon, searching for the glint of a Greek spear or the silhouette of a mast, but found only the shimmer of the heat haze. The beach was truly empty. The Greeks were gone. The realization began to spread through the streets of Troy, not as a celebration, but as a staggering, disorienting shock. The gates, which had remained bolted and barred against the terror of Achilles and Agamemnon, were suddenly the only thing standing between the people and the freedom they had forgotten. The psychological wall had fallen long before the physical one was even touched. They looked at the horse and saw a symbol of their own endurance. They saw a trophy of a war they had survived through sheer grit. They failed to see the craftsmanship of a carpenter who had built a hollow belly. They failed to hear the shallow, synchronized breathing of 30 elite warriors cramped within the darkness of that timber frame. The horse was the ultimate mirror. It reflected back exactly what the Trojans most desperately needed to see: an end. The Greek retreat was a masterpiece of theater, played to an audience that was too tired to question the plot. As the morning sun rose over the abandoned camp, the Trojans prepared to do the one thing that 10 years of warfare could never force them to do. They prepared to open the gates and welcome their own destruction, convinced that the silence on the beach was the sound of peace. The morning sun rose over a shoreline that had changed for the first time in a decade. Where thousands of black ships had once lined the sand, and where the smoke of Greek cook fires had drifted into the Trojan sky, there was now only a haunting, empty expanse. But in the center of that desolation stood an object that defied logic. It was a massive, silent sentinel of worked timber, towering over the plain like a ghost. To the Trojans watching from the battlements, it appeared as a monument to a war that had finally burned itself out. To understand how this wooden structure achieved what 10 years of blood could not, we must look at the man who built it and the psychological architecture of the trap itself. The construction of the horse was not the work of a celebrated general like Agamemnon or a legendary fighter like Achilles. It was the masterwork of Appius, a man whose name is often lost to the more violent chapters of the myth. Appius was a master carpenter and a focused engineer who understood the soul of wood and the geometry of weight. Under the direction of Odysseus, Appius gathered his tools and turned the Greek camp into a shipyard of a different kind. Using the fir and pine harvested from the slopes of Mount Ida, he began to assemble a structure that was essentially a naval vessel turned inside out. The ribs of the horse were curved like the hull of a trireme, fitted with a precision that ensured no sliver of light would escape from within, and no sound would betray the cargo hidden in its belly. This was a feat of high engineering for the Bronze Age. The horse had to be large enough to hold a strike team of elite warriors, yet balanced enough to be dragged across uneven sand and through the rocky approaches to the city. Appius designed a hidden hatch blended perfectly into the grain of the wood along the flank, secured by internal bolts that could only be released from the inside. There were no external handles, no visible seams, and no obvious way to peer into the dark void within. The hollow interior was a sweltering, airless chamber where the heat of the Anatolian sun would soon turn the wood into an oven. It was an engineering masterclass in concealment, designed to withstand the physical scrutiny of an enemy that had spent 10 years looking for any sign of Greek trickery. While Appius worked on the frame, Odysseus began the most dangerous selection process of the war. He was not looking for the strongest arms, but for the steeliest nerves. This was a surgical team of killers, men who could sit in absolute darkness for hours or even days without making a sound. Among those chosen were Menelaus, the king whose stolen wife had started the conflict, and Neoptolemus, the volatile son of the fallen Achilles. These men were seasoned by a decade of slaughter, yet the hours spent inside the horse were likely the most harrowing of their lives. They sat in a cramped vertical tomb, listening to the jubilant cries of the Trojans outside, feeling the vibration of the wheels as they were dragged toward the citadel. The tension inside the wooden belly was a weapon in itself. A single sneeze, the accidental clatter of a bronze shield, or a moment of panic would have resulted in the horse being set ablaze, roasting the greatest heroes of Greece alive in a pyre of their own making. But engineering and bravery were only half of the equation. The Greeks knew that the Trojans were a people of profound piety, a city that believed its survival was tied to the favor of the gods. The horse was never intended to look like a weapon. It was designed to look like a peace offering. This is where the military tactic merged with the religious superstitions of the era. The Greeks left an inscription on the structure claiming it was a votive offering to the goddess Athena. By doing so, they weaponized Trojan faith. The Greeks knew that if they simply left a wooden statue, the Trojans might burn it out of spite. But by dedicating it to Athena, the patron of wisdom and war, they created a religious barrier. To destroy the horse was to commit sacrilege. To burn the offering was to invite the wrath of a goddess who had already shown her displeasure with the Greeks. To sell the lie, the Greeks left behind a single man named Sinon. His role was to play the part of a deserter, a victim of Greek cruelty who had been left behind as a human sacrifice. Standing before King Priam, Sinon delivered a scripted performance of grief and betrayal. He explained that the horse had been built to such an immense scale specifically to prevent the Trojans from taking it inside their gates. He claimed that if the horse ever entered the city, Troy would become the master of all Greece, protected forever by the favor of Athena. It was a stroke of psychological genius. By telling the Trojans they were not supposed to have the horse, the Greeks guaranteed that the Trojans would want it. They took the enemy's pride and their fear of the divine and used them as the rope to pull the horse forward. As the sun began to set on that first day of perceived peace, the Trojans did exactly what Odysseus had predicted. They didn't see a wooden cage filled with their murderers. They saw a spiritual insurance policy. They saw a way to capture the very luck that had deserted the Greeks. Ignoring the warnings of those who sensed a trap, the people of Troy began to dismantle their own defenses. They tore down sections of the Scaean gates to make room for the massive structure, physically breaching the walls that had held firm for 10 years. As the horse creaked forward on its rollers, crossing the threshold of the city, the trap was finally set. The religious superstition of the era had done what the greatest army in the world could not. It had convinced a city to invite its own destruction through the front door, leaving the warriors inside to wait for the cover of night. But as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows across the sands of the Troad, the silence was not absolute. A lone figure emerged from the salt scrub in the reeds near the shoreline. This was Sinon, a man whose name would become synonymous with the art of the lethal deception. He was not left behind by accident, nor was he a straggler of a retreating force. He was the final, essential component of a psychological trap designed by Odysseus. To the Trojans who discovered him, he appeared as a pathetic, trembling wretch, his clothes torn and his skin marked by fresh, weeping wounds. These were not injuries sustained in battle, but self-inflicted marks of a desperate performance. When the Trojan scouts dragged him before King Priam, they didn't see a warrior, they saw a victim. Sinon played his part with a mastery that rivaled any actor on the stages of Athens. He wept openly, cursing his own kin and claiming that the Greeks, led by the cunning Ulysses, had sought to offer him as a human sacrifice to appease the gods for a safe voyage home. He spoke of old grudges and a narrow escape from the altar just as the winds began to turn. To a city that had endured 10 years of relentless siege, Sinon's story resonated with a profound, shared exhaustion. He offered them the one thing they craved more than victory, the belief that the war was finally over and that their enemies were as broken and desperate as they were. King Priam, a man defined by his nobility and his aging heart, looked upon this bloodied refugee and saw a mirror of the suffering his own people had endured. He ordered Sinon's shackles to be removed, offering him sanctuary within the very walls he was sent to undermine. It was here, in the shadow of the Scaean Gate, that the ultimate lie was told. When asked about the massive wooden structure looming over the beach, Sinon didn't hesitate. He claimed the horse was an offering to Athena, built to such a colossal scale specifically to prevent the Trojans from bringing it into their city. If the horse remained outside the walls, he argued, the Greeks might return with the goddess's favor. But if the Trojans were to bring it into the heart of their citadel, the favor of Athena would shift to them, and Troy would one day lead a conquest against the very lands of Greece. Within the city, a chaotic internal war of intuition began to brew. The public, fueled by a decade of grief and a sudden intoxicating hope, clamored to celebrate. But there were those whose instincts remained sharp. Cassandra, the daughter of Priam, moved through the crowds like a ghost. She had been gifted with the power of prophecy by Apollo, but cursed never to be believed. She saw not a gift, but a hollow vessel filled with blood and fire. Her screams for the citizens to burn the idol were dismissed as the ravages of a fractured mind. To the people of Troy, she was simply a casualty of the war's psychological toll, a woman whose trauma had finally unspooled into madness. Then came Laocoon, a priest of Poseidon, who brought a more visceral warning. He did not rely on visions, but on the cold logic of a soldier priest. He famously warned his countrymen to fear the Greeks, especially when they came bearing gifts. In a moment of defiant clarity, he hurled a heavy spear at the horse's wooden flank. The weapon struck with a resonant, hollow thud, a sound that should have betrayed the presence of the men hiding within. For a heartbeat, the fate of the city hung in the balance. The air grew thick with a sudden, localized tension. But the gods, or perhaps a cruel alignment of chance, intervened. From the churning surf of the Aegean, two massive sea serpents emerged, sliding across the sand with terrifying speed. They ignored the gathered crowds and coiled themselves around Laocoon and his two young sons, crushing the life out of them before the eyes of the horrified onlookers. To the Trojans, this was not a random tragedy or a calculated distraction. It was a divine omen. They believed the gods had struck Laocoon down for desecrating a holy offering. The priest's agonizing death became the final piece of evidence Sinon needed. The debate was over. The skepticism that might have saved the city was replaced by a frantic religious fervor. The decision was made. The horse had to enter Troy, but the structure was too vast for the ancient gates to accommodate. In a final, crowning irony, the Trojans took up sledges and levers against their own defenses. These were the same walls that had stood firm against Achilles' rage and Agamemnon's ambition, walls that were said to have been built by the hands of gods. Now, the citizens themselves tore a breach in the stone, creating a jagged hole to allow their own destruction to pass through. They placed rollers beneath the horse's heavy feet and attached long hempen ropes to its neck. A procession formed, a grotesque parody of a victory parade. Children sang hymns and draped garlands of flowers over the horse's wooden legs, while the men who had spent a decade guarding the ramparts now strained their muscles to pull the idol inward. 4 times the massive structure jolted and stalled on the threshold of the breach, and 4 times the armor of the Greeks inside clattered loudly against the timber. But the Trojans, blinded by the promise of peace and the performance of Sinon, heard nothing but the sounds of their own jubilation. They pulled the horse into the center of the city, placing it in the shadow of the temple, unaware that they had just invited the night to swallow them whole. As the sun dipped below the Aegean, casting long, jagged shadows across the Scaean gate, the atmosphere within the walls of Troy shifted from cautious curiosity to a feverish, desperate joy. For 10 years, the city had been a cage. For 10 years, the horizon had been jagged with the masts of Greek ships and the smoke of Greek campfires. Now, that horizon was empty. The sea was a flat, dark mirror, and the only thing remaining of the invaders was the massive, silent wooden structure standing in the heart of the citadel. The Trojans believed they had outlasted the gods' own cruelty. They dragged the horse to the very threshold of the temple of Athena, treating it not as a suspicious relic, but as a trophy of their own endurance. Priam's people, normally cautious and battle-hardened, succumbed to the most dangerous weapon of all, the sudden absence of fear. They brought out the heavy Thracian wines, the stores of grain they had guarded so fiercely, and the oil for the lamps. The celebration was not merely a party, it was a collective exhale of a population that had forgotten how to breathe. Music, long silenced by the sounds of clashing bronze and the screams of the dying, filled the streets. Lyres were tuned and the rhythmic beat of drums echoed off the limestone walls. Men who had spent a decade holding shields now held cups. Women danced in the squares, their feet kicking up the dust of a decade of siege. But as the moon climbed higher, the frantic energy began to sour into a heavy, drunken lethargy. One by one, the torches flickered out. The songs grew slurred, then faded into a low hum, and finally into a thick, suffocating silence. The city, exhausted by its own jubilation, fell into a deep, alcohol-induced sleep. Torches sputtered in their brackets, casting dying embers across the stone courtyards. The guards, convinced that the war was a memory, allowed their spears to lean against the walls, their heads lolled against their chests. Troy was finally quiet, but it was the silence of a graveyard rather than a sanctuary. Inside the belly of the horse, the world was very different. While the Trojans celebrated, 30 of Greece's most lethal killers sat in a darkness so absolute it felt physical. The air inside the wooden cavity was thick with the smell of pine resin, stale sweat, and the sharp tang of oiled bronze. They had been folded into this space for hours, their limbs cramping, their breath shallow and synchronized. Every cheer from the Trojan streets had vibrated through the timber walls, a mocking reminder of how close they were to discovery. Odysseus sat near the hatch, his hand likely resting on the hilt of his sword, his ears tuned to the changing sounds of the city. He would have felt the vibrations of the dancing subside. He would have heard the fading of the flutes and the eventual rhythmic snoring of the men just feet away on the other side of the wood. The heat inside the horse was stifling, a humid microclimate of anticipation and terror. If one man had sneezed, if a single scabbard had clattered against a rib of the horse, the plan would have ended in a bonfire. Outside, a shadow moved through the embers of the city. Sinon, the man who had lied so convincingly that he had convinced a nation to commit suicide, stood in the darkness. He looked toward the sea, toward the hidden island of Tenedos where the Greek fleet lay in wait, their hulls dark and their oars ready. He moved with the practiced stealth of a man who knew he was the only living bridge between two armies. Reaching the high battlements, or perhaps the tomb of Achilles, he raised a single torch high into the night air. It was a small flame, a pinprick of light against the vastness of the Trojan sky, but it was the most important signal in the history of warfare. On the decks of the distant ships, lookouts caught the glint. The order was whispered, not shouted. The fleet began to move, hundreds of ships slicing through the water, returning to the shores they had pretended to abandon. Back at the horse, the signal was felt rather than seen, a soft, rhythmic tapping on the wooden hull. Sinon had returned to give the word. Inside the dark chamber, the tension snapped. The soldiers didn't move with the haste of panicked men, but with the cold, mechanical precision of a trap being sprung. Odysseus reached for the bolt. The sound of wood sliding against wood was in the stillness of the Trojan night as loud as a thunderclap to the men inside, but to the sleeping city it was nothing more than the settling of a building. The hatch swung downward. The cool night air rushed into the sweltering dark of the horse's belly, smelling of salt and the dying fires of the city. It was the first fresh air they had breathed in nearly a day. One by one, the Greeks descended. They didn't use ladders. They slid down ropes, their feet hitting the dust with muffled thuds. Neoptolemus, the son of Achilles, stepped out with the blood hunger of his father. Menelaus followed, his eyes searching the dark for the palace of the man who had stolen his wife. They stood in the center of the silent plaza, shadows among shadows. The city of Troy lay helpless before them, draped in the heavy sleep of the defeated. The Greeks did not immediately shout or charge. They moved toward the gates first, their blades drawn and held low. The few sentries they encountered never even had the chance to wake. A hand over the mouth, a sharp blade across the throat, and the silence of the night remained unbroken. As they reached the great Scaean gate, the heavy bronze bolts were drawn back from the inside. The massive doors, which had defied the greatest army in the world for 10 years, swang open from the inside. Outside, the first of the returning ships had already hit the sand. Thousands of Greeks were pouring onto the beach, running toward the open maw of the city. The celebration was over. The night of the horse had ended, and the slaughter of Troy had begun. The night air, once thick with the smell of sacrificial wine and roasting meat, now carried the sharp, metallic tang of bronze and the first hints of smoke. At the Scaean gates, the massive timber doors that had defied the Greek army for a decade, a group of shadows moved with lethal precision. These were the men who had emerged from the belly of the wooden beast, their joints stiff but their blades sharp. They worked the heavy iron bolts in silence, the grease of the mechanisms muffled by the distant, dying sounds of the Trojan revelry. As the gates groaned open, the darkness of the plain outside seemed to rush in. But the plain was no longer empty. The Greek fleet had returned under the cover of a moonless sky, and thousands of soldiers were already at the threshold. They did not shout. They did not blow trumpets. They moved like a rising tide, spilling into the streets of Troy with a singular, terrifying purpose. The massacre began in the lower districts, where the common folk lay in the deep, heavy sleep of the exhausted and the intoxicated. For 10 years, these people had woken to the sound of gulls and the distant clatter of shields on the ramparts. Tonight, they woke to the sound of their own doors being splintered by axes. There was no time for the Trojans to reach for their spears or find their helmets. The Greeks moved house to house, a disciplined machine of vengeance that had been fueled by 10 years of frustration and loss. Men were cut down in their doorways. Children were snatched from their beds. The transition from a city of celebration to a slaughterhouse was instantaneous. The screams began to rise, a discordant chorus that finally pierced the fog of the Trojan palace, but by then, it was already too late. To accelerate the chaos, the Greeks began to set the city on fire. They tossed torches into the thatched roofs of the granaries and the wooden balconies of the villas. The dry summer heat had turned the city into a tinderbox. What started as small flickers of orange quickly transformed into a roaring wall of heat that illuminated the slaughter with a hellish glow. The smoke became a suffocating shroud, blinding the defenders who tried to mount a desperate rearguard action in the narrow alleys. The great city, the jewel of the Hellespont, was being systematically dismantled by fire and steel. Every landmark of Trojan pride, every monument to their ancestors was being licked by flames that reached higher than the walls themselves. In the high citadel, the house of Priam faced its final hour. The elderly king, a man who had seen 50 sons fall to the Greek blade, heard the crashing of the palace doors. He did not flee. In a final, heartbreaking act of defiance, the old man reached for his armor, his trembling hands unable to even fasten the buckles of his breastplate. He sought refuge at the altar of Zeus in the inner courtyard, hoping that the sanctity of the gods might stay the hands of the invaders. But the Greeks who entered the palace were not the honorable warriors of the earlier years of the war. They were men possessed by a frantic, jagged cruelty. Neoptolemus, the son of Achilles, burst into the courtyard. He carried none of his father's occasional capacity for mercy, only his father's terrifying strength. He found Priam's son, Polites, fleeing through the colonnades and struck him down in front of his parents. As the young prince's blood pooled on the sacred stone, Priam cursed the boy who had murdered him in spirit before murdering him in flesh. Neoptolemus dragged the aged king by his white hair through the blood of his son, bringing him to the very edge of the altar. With a single brutal stroke, the line of Dardanus was severed. The crown of Troy fell into the dust, and the king who once negotiated with Achilles for the body of Hector was left a headless trunk on the cold stone. As the palace fell, the systematic looting reached its peak. The gold of Troy, the treasures of the East, and the sacred statues of the gods were hauled out into the streets to be divided among the Greek captains. But the most precious and tragic of the spoils were the people. The women of the royal house, who had watched the destruction of their world from the high battlements, were now gathered like cattle. Hecuba, the queen mother, saw her daughters and granddaughters bound with hemp ropes. Andromache, the widow of Hector, was torn from the ruins of her home, her status as a princess of the city erased in a single night of violence. They were no longer queens or wives, they were property, destined for the galleys and the looms of their enemies across the Aegean. The sun began to rise over Mount Ida, but its light struggled to penetrate the thick black columns of smoke that rose from the ruins. Troy was no longer a city, it was a charred skeleton. The Scaean gates, which had stood as a symbol of Trojan invincibility, now hung on broken hinges, leading into a landscape of ash and silence. The Greek army, laden with gold and followed by a long, weeping line of captives, began the march back to the beach. They left behind a void where a civilization had once breathed. The horse, the instrument of their entry, stood amidst the embers, a silent witness to the totality of the ruin it had invited. The 10-year siege had ended not with a grand duel on the plain, but with the whimpering of the enslaved and the roar of a fire that would burn in the memory of the world forever. The myth of Troy had been written in blood, and the city itself had been surrendered to the earth. For nearly 3,000 years, the smoke from the burning towers of Troy existed only as a whisper of ghosts and the rhythmic meter of epic poetry. To the scholars of the Enlightenment and the elite of the Victorian era, the city was a grand stage for a moral fable, as tangible as a cloud and as historical as a dream. The names of Priam and Hector were relegated to the same shelf as the gods who supposedly championed them. The geography was dismissed as poetic license, a landscape invented to host a tragedy that never truly happened. But beneath the sun-bleached soil of a quiet corner of modern-day Turkey, the earth held a different memory, one that refused to remain buried in the pages of a book. The transition from the world of myth to the world of dirt began with a man who possessed a legendary ego and a literal interpretation of ancient verse. Heinrich Schliemann was a self-made millionaire, a restless traveler, and a man obsessed with the idea that the Iliad was not a poem but a map. In the early 1870s, he arrived at a dusty mound known locally as Hisarlik, guided by the intuition of a local landowner named Frank Calvert. Calvert had already suspected the mound held the secrets of the Bronze Age, but he lacked the funds to prove it. Schliemann had the money, the ambition, and a complete lack of scientific restraint. He didn't arrive with the delicate brushes and careful grids of a modern researcher. He arrived with a small army of laborers and a directive to dig fast. Schliemann believed that the Troy of King Priam would be at the very bottom of the mound, the oldest and deepest layer. In his frantic search for gold and glory, he committed a catastrophic archaeological crime. He drove a massive trench, 40 feet deep, right through the heart of the hill. In doing so, he leveled walls, smashed pottery, and discarded centuries of invaluable evidence. He was looking for a specific city, and in his haste, he tore through the actual Troy he was searching for, reaching down into a stratum that predated the Trojan War by over 1,000 years. He eventually found a cache of gold jewelry which he famously draped over his wife, declaring it the Jewels of Helen. He was wrong. The gold belonged to a civilization that had turned to dust long before the Greeks ever set sail. Despite his reckless methods, Schliemann's work changed the world. He proved that Hisarlik was not just a hill, but a tell, a man-made mountain of cities built one on top of the other. As more disciplined researchers followed in his wake, they began to peel back the layers of time with the precision the site deserved. They discovered that Troy was not one city, but at least 9 distinct settlements, each rising from the ruins of the lost. This was a place that had been conquered, burned, shaken by the earth, and rebuilt for over 3 millennia. The challenge for the modern investigator was to find which of these layers matched the city described in the songs of the blind poet. 2 candidates emerged from the rubble, the layers known as Troy 6 and Troy 7a. For a long time, Troy 6 was the favorite. It was a city of immense wealth and architectural grace. Its limestone walls were massive, rising over 30 feet high and featuring a distinct inward slope, a design intended to withstand the violent tremors of a region plagued by tectonic activity. It was a thriving trade hub, perfectly positioned to control the trade routes between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. It was a city of heroes. However, the end of Troy 6 does not match the story of the Iliad. The evidence in the stones tells of a geological catastrophe, not a military one. Great cracks in the masonry, shifted foundations, and collapsed sections of the upper walls point to a massive earthquake that leveled the city around 1250 BC. It was a tragedy of nature, but there were no signs of a grand fire or a systematic slaughter. Then there is the layer immediately above it, Troy 7a. This city was built in the shadow of the earthquake's ruins, using the salvaged stones of the previous era. But the atmosphere of this settlement was entirely different. While Troy 6 was spacious and grand, Troy 7a was cramped and desperate. The large villas were divided into small, crowded rooms. Most tellingly, the inhabitants had buried massive storage jars called pithoi beneath the floors filled with grain and liquid to sustain a population that could no longer go out into the fields. This was a city under siege. It was a place where people were hunkering down, living in fear, and preparing for a long, grueling struggle. And unlike the earthquake damage of the layer below, the end of Troy 7a was marked by the unmistakable signature of human cruelty. When archaeologists excavated this layer, they found bronze arrowheads of a Greek design embedded in the walls. They found unburied skeletons in the streets, men and women who had fallen where they stood, their bones showing the marks of blunt force trauma. Most significantly, they found a layer of ash and charred wood several feet thick covering the entire site. Here, finally, was the fire. This city was sacked, looted, and burned to the ground around 1180 BC, a date that aligns remarkably well with the traditional chronologies of the Trojan War. Yet, as we look at these scorched remains, the question shifts. Is this the Trojan War, or is it merely one of many? The archaeology suggests that the conflict was likely far more complex than a 10-year grudge over a stolen queen. To the east, the Hittite Empire kept records on clay tablets that mention a city called Wilusa, a name that linguistic historians link directly to the Greek Ilion. These tablets speak of ongoing friction over this strategic port, involving a people they called the Ahiyawa, the Achaeans. The Trojan War was probably not a single romantic crusade. It was likely a series of raids and economic conflicts, fueled by the cold logic of survival in a collapsing world. The Greeks didn't sail 1,000 ships for a face, they sailed for the control of the Dardanelles, the gateway to the wealth of the East. The legendary Trojan horse might have been a poetic metaphor for a battering ram, or perhaps a coded reference to Poseidon, the god of horses and earthquakes, whose shifting of the earth finally allowed the Greeks to breach the walls. The physical reality of Troy 7a provides a somber counterpoint to the epic. In the poetry, the fall of the city is a grand finale of gods and kings. In the dirt, it is a story of a terrified population hiding their grain beneath the floorboards, only to be overtaken by a fire that turned their homes into an oven. The archaeology doesn't destroy the myth, it anchors it. It shows us that while the poets may have inflated the numbers and invented the dialogue, they were remembering a real catastrophe. They were singing about a place where the wind really does howl across the plain, where the walls were once high, and where a civilization truly did vanish into the smoke. The truth of Troy lies somewhere in the space between the verse and the ash, a reminder that every legend has a heartbeat of historical pain. If we accept that this pain was real, that the smoke once rising from these hills was the funeral pyre of a city, we must eventually face the most difficult pillar of the legend. We have to look at the wooden horse. To a modern ear, the story sounds like a nursery tale or a piece of absurdist theater. We are told of a giant wooden effigy left on a windswept beach, a vessel filled with elite warriors that was somehow accepted by a cautious, war-weary people as a religious offering. It is a story that strains the limits of military logic and common sense. Yet the horse is the very thing that has kept Troy alive in the human imagination for 3 millennia. Historians and archaeologists do not look for a literal hollow statue when they dig through these trenches. They look for the reality that the statue hides. They look for the machinery of war, or the whims of nature that a poet, singing centuries after the event, might have simplified into a single haunting image. To find the truth, we must deconstruct the icon and look at what the horse actually represented to the people of the Bronze Age. The first, and perhaps most scientifically grounded theory, suggests that the horse was never a physical object at all, but a poetic shorthand for a natural disaster. Consider the god who ruled the waves and the foundations of the earth, Poseidon. In the Homeric world, he is the earth shaker, the deity who rattles the world and brings the works of man to ruin. Crucially, his sacred animal was the horse. When we examine the physical layers of the city known as Troy 6, which was the most prosperous and powerful iteration of the site, we do not see the charred remains of a city sacked by an invading army. Instead, we see tilted walls, buckled foundations, and massive stones shifted out of alignment. We see the clear, violent signature of a massive tectonic event. The Troad region sits atop a volatile network of fault lines. If an earthquake struck at the height of a Greek siege, the impenetrable walls of Troy would have crumbled in an instant. To the survivors of such a catastrophe, it would not have felt like a geological shift. It would have felt like a divine assault from the Earthshaker himself. In the retelling of the story, the horse of Poseidon becomes the vehicle of the city's downfall. The metaphor is elegant and devastating. The god's horse broke the wall, and the Greeks simply walked through the ruins. Over centuries of oral storytelling, the symbol of the horse was stripped of its seismic context and transformed into a literal wooden creature left at the gates. If the horse was not a tremor in the earth, perhaps it was a very specific kind of nightmare on the ground. This leads us to the second theory, which envisions the horse as a piece of experimental military technology, the battering ram. Ancient warfare was a slow, grinding process of attrition, and the most effective way to end a siege was to breach the gate. We have historical records from the Assyrians, who were the undisputed masters of siegecraft, describing massive wooden rams used to splinter the defenses of walled cities. To protect the soldiers operating these heavy machines from the rain of flaming arrows, stones, and boiling oil coming from above, the wooden frames were covered in wet animal hides. More often than not, these were horse hides. Imagine the sight from the battlements of Troy, a massive, looming structure of timber draped in the raw, heavy skins of horses, thumping rhythmically against the gate of the city with the force of a dozen men. To a scout watching from a distance, or a survivor recounting the terror to his children, the description of a great wooden horse attacking the city walls is not a fantasy, but a technical description filtered through the lens of time. It was a beast of wood and hide that eventually forced its way into the heart of the city, carrying the destruction of the Greeks within its frame. There is a third possibility that speaks to the sheer scale of the conflict and the ingenuity of the Mycenaean mind. This theory suggests the horse was actually an early form of the siege tower. In the centuries following the purported fall of Troy, engineers began building massive, multi-story towers on wheels that allowed soldiers to reach the height of the parapets and climb directly onto the walls. These structures were often given nicknames or zoomorphic features to intimidate the enemy. They were tall, they were constructed from local pine and fir, and they carried men within their bellies. If the Greeks managed to construct even a primitive version of such a machine, its appearance would have been unlike anything the Trojans had ever seen. A mountain of timber moving slowly across the plain, filled with hidden death, would have looked like a monster born of the woods. The transition from a wooden tower to a wooden horse is a small leap for a culture that valued symbolism and poetic meter over engineering blueprints. In the heat of battle and the fog of memory, a tower that birthed soldiers onto the walls becomes a horse that hid them in its ribs. This brings us to the most fascinating part of the mystery, the process of the oral tradition itself. This is the alchemy of history. For nearly 400 years after the fall of Troy, the story was not a written text. It was a living, breathing song performed by bards. In that long twilight of the Greek Dark Ages, the fine details of military logistics were lost, replaced by imagery that could capture the imagination of an audience sitting around a fire. A complex discussion of tectonic shifts or the specific tension of a battering ram's ropes is difficult to fit into dactylic hexameter. A wooden horse, however, is an image that stays. It is a perfect narrative device. It represents the ultimate deception, the cold brilliance of Odysseus, and the fatal hubris of a Trojan people who believed the war was finally over. By the time the poets crystallized the story into the epics we know today, the technical reality was discarded. The machine died, but the metaphor lived. We see this process in almost all human myth-making. When a historical truth is too heavy or too complex to carry through the generations, we craft a vessel of imagination to hold its weight. We take the terror of an earthquake or the brute force of a siege engine and we wrap it in a story that makes sense of the suffering. The horse is not a lie, it is a distillation. It is the memory of a breakthrough, the memory of a wall that failed, and the memory of a night when the world changed forever. Whether it was the earth shaking beneath their feet or a wooden tower looming over their homes, the people of Troy knew that something massive and unstoppable had breached their sanctuary. They didn't need to know the mechanics of the machine to feel the impact of the blow. As we look at the ruins today, we realize that the search for the physical horse is a distraction. The horse is the symbol of the moment a civilization realizes its defenses are an illusion. It is the shadow cast by a real war, a shadow that grew longer and more fantastic as the sun set on the Bronze Age. The truth of the horse is not found in wood or bronze, but in the way we choose to remember the machines that break us. For those who survived the initial slaughter, the horse was merely the catalyst for a much longer, more agonizing displacement. The fall of Troy was not an isolated ending. It was the birth of the diaspora. Among the ruins, as the heat of the conflagration turned marble to lime, a Trojan prince named Aeneas shouldered his aging father and led a small band of refugees toward the sea. He carried with him more than just the survivors. He carried the Penates, the sacred household gods, the very soul of a dead city. His journey would not lead back to what was lost, but forward toward the distant hills of Latium. In this mythic logic, the death of Troy was a necessary sacrifice for the eventual birth of Rome. The fire that consumed the Troad was the same flame that would one day light the Roman Forum, proving that the most enduring empires are often built on the bones of those who lost everything. This migration turned a local defeat into a foundational myth for Western civilization, ensuring that the blood of Priam's line would flow through the veins of Caesars. But if the losers found a second life in exile, the winners found only a slow, bitter decline. The Greeks did not leave Troy as heroes, they left as ghosts in waiting. During the final night of the sack, the discipline of the phalanx had dissolved into the madness of the mob. The sanctity of the temples was ignored as the victors dragged women from the altars and stained the holy ground with the blood of the innocent. This collective impiety did not go unnoticed by the heavens. The gods who had championed the Greek cause turned their faces away in disgust. The sea, once their highway to glory, became their graveyard. The return journeys, or the nostoi, are a catalogue of tragedy that mirrors the violence of the war itself. Think of Agamemnon, the king of kings, returning to Mycenae with the spoils of a decade-long siege. He expected a conqueror's welcome, but he found only a crimson carpet, and a wife's heart had hardened into flint during his absence. He was murdered in his own bath, his glory stripped away by a household blade before he could even wash the dust of Troy from his skin. Or consider the lesser Ajax, who survived the storm at sea only to be struck down by a trident for his arrogance, his ship shattered against the jagged rocks of Gyrae. Even Menelaus, who recovered the wife he burned a world to reclaim, found himself drifting for years in Egypt, a king without a kingdom, haunted by the cost of his pride. Then there is Odysseus, the clever architect of the horse itself. He paid for his genius with 10 years of wandering and the lives of every man who served under him. He watched his crew vanish into the maws of monsters and the treacherous currents of the deep, eventually arriving home alone, a beggar in his own halls. His return was not a triumph, but a desperate struggle to reclaim a life that had moved on without him. This was the true price of the wooden horse. The victory was a hollow shell, much like the beast that facilitated it. These stories mark the definitive end of the heroic age, a time when men walked with gods and did deeds beyond the reach of modern memory. After the diaspora, the heroes either died on the voyage home or faded into the quiet obscurity of old age. The world grew colder, the gods became more distant, and the grand narratives of the Bronze Age were replaced by the harsh realities of a dawning Iron Age. The cycle of the war concludes not with a shout of triumph, but with the quiet sound of oars dipping into the water and the crackle of a dying hearth, leaving behind a world that would never again see its like. The smoke from those ruins drifted across the Aegean, fading into the haze of history, but the image of that hollow wooden beast stayed behind. It outlived the heroes who climbed into its belly, and the city that burned because of it. What began as a desperate stratagem on a salt-swept beach has transformed into one of our most enduring metaphors for the unseen threat. Today, we no longer look for towering sculptures on our doorsteps. Instead, we find them in the silent lines of binary code pulsing through our networks. When a modern Trojan horse breaches a firewall, it mirrors the ancient ruse with chilling precision. It arrives disguised as something useful, something desired. A software update, a harmless attachment, a gift of digital convenience. We invite it in, granting it passage past our defenses, only for the payload to trigger once the gates are closed. The digital age has not changed the fundamental nature of the trick. It has only given it a new, invisible skin. The battleground has shifted from the dusty plains of Anatolia to the server rooms of the 21st century, proving that our greatest vulnerabilities are rarely found in our walls, but in our curiosity and our trust. Beyond the screen, the shadow of the horse looms over our halls of power. In politics and social discourse, the term describes any force that seeks to dismantle a system from the inside. It represents the subversive element that wears the mask of an ally, the policy that hides a hidden agenda, or the populist movement that promises salvation while carrying the seeds of ruin. It is the ultimate cautionary tale for any civilization that the most effective way to destroy a fortress is to convince the inhabitants to open the gates themselves. Why does this story continue to resonate nearly 3,000 years later? Perhaps because it speaks to a fundamental flaw in the human psyche. We are hardwired to hope, and that hope makes us susceptible to the Greek gift. The Trojans didn't bring the horse inside because they were foolish. They brought it in because they were exhausted. They wanted the war to be over. They wanted to believe that their gods had finally smiled upon them. Deception succeeds best when it offers us exactly what we want to see. Whether there was ever a physical horse of fur or maple matters less than the truth it carries. The wooden statue remains a phantom, a ghost of the Bronze Age. Yet its legacy is etched into every password we create and every alliance we question. The walls of Troy fell because a city forgot that a gift is rarely free. As we move further from the ruins of the past, the warning of the horse remains as sharp as a bronze blade. Trust is a fragile thing, and the most dangerous enemies are often the ones we welcome into our homes with open arms.